So I do a number of reaction videos, and I choose these videos intentionally because I want to highlight what is being said on the other side and why. And generally speaking, we have a conversation. They say something, and I say, no, it's not exactly like that because here are the facts, and I lay that out. Today is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to Redacted, which is they're very right-wing conspiracy theory-ish, right? Okay, so here we're going to look at this video here, but the next one is the deep state's plan for Africa. The next one is corrupt media pushing for World War III. The next one talking about illegal aliens. This one talking about actual aliens, right? But this video, this one I'm going to be talking about today is Russian civilians are being prepped for war. Well, I mean, I've been telling you that. So I wanted to see what they were saying, and again, it's really interesting how this lines up. Now, they said Russians are being prepared for war, and then you'll see how this is working out.
People living in Donbas and Crimea are training civilians in case they have to fight Ukrainians in their region.
Okay, so the headline said Russian, and she's talking about people living in Crimea, occupied Crimea. So that's not Russian, but she will talk about Russians, or her guest will talk about Russians later. But nevertheless, in occupied Crimea, they are training to be mobilized. Now, not even army mobilized, but you'll see in a second.
Means that the people living there have been living in terror of Ukraine's army, as they have been for over a decade, since 2000.
Well, I wouldn't say exactly that the people in Crimea have been living in terror. They've been living pretty much the good life, feeling that they were protected.
2014. Joining us to discuss this is Redacted correspondent Mike Jones, who is in Russia. Thank you for joining us and bringing these videos to highlight. Can you give us a history of why these people have been afraid of Ukrainian attacks since 2014 as a little context?
Or can you explain how they weren't afraid of anything before 2014 when Russia intervened, and in 2013 they were living pretty peacefully? Oh, sorry, that was me just interjecting.
Yes, so as we know, until recently, certainly the Crimean Peninsula was blockaded, had its fresh water supply blocked by the Kiev regime. Prior to the commencement of the special military operation. So it was
because the Russians had come in, taken over, had an illegal election, claimed that it was now Russia, and acted as if it was. So that's why they blocked the water supply, but I'm just adding a little context.
It was very clear after certainly Crimea voted to become part of the Russian Federation that
with 90-something%, what was it, 97% vote, they voted to do that, and there is no way that that was a legitimate election. Look at what was the last election in Russia? About 45% of the population voted, and their 85% of the population voted when they had just came out, and 97% of that 85% voted to join Crimea. That's nuts.
It was quite likely there'd be some form of a retaliation. How that would take place wasn't known. So measures were taken way back then by not even the authorities. This was a homegrown sort of civilian / former military movement to prepare civilians for not just military, but emergency situations, such as medical.
Okay. Wouldn't call it homegrown. It was informal, yes, not exactly homegrown.
Training and crisis management and these sort of disciplines.
Now, I can't help but watch this and liken this to the American prepper movement. It feels to me like, wow, humans, we all have a lot in common. We all just want to prepare for emergencies and protect our families. But in America, preppers are called crazy. What is the reaction to these people where they live?
Well, the big difference in those two sort of analogies that you draw is obviously the American recent civilization, as we know it, the past 200 years, hasn't been under direct threat, hasn't had its shores invaded in the same way as certainly the people of the Crimean Peninsula, as one of the instructors of...
That's right, the Russians invaded the Crimean Peninsula.
The Warrior program explained to me, in pretty much all the major conflicts in the past 100 years, the Crimean Peninsula has been called upon to fight and has often spilt blood, has become a battleground. So this is something that's very fresh in their memory and something that they feel the need to prepare for. So there was a very
Well, that and they seized land, and the people that they seized it from weren't happy about that. So there's that as well.
Real need, as opposed to perhaps an imagined one of others who may still wish to learn very useful skills, but don't have the sort of same immediate requirement.
Now, the reason that I normally do these kind of videos is to see how they're projecting for the other side. And what they're projecting to the other side is, see, these big bad Ukrainians, they're going to come and do this unless they prepare. But it's really interesting to see, like, we're actually in agreement in the sense that, yes, you see them working to train up the people in the occupied areas in order to use them to fight the Ukrainians as well, which is something that we know. His why is all wrong, but what is we're in complete agreement with.
Yes. Now, you found these videos where civilians are being trained by veterans, but we know that during the Maidan coup, civilians were prepared to fight the
Maidan revolution, not Maidan coup. And notice how the assumptions just slip in very easily, where it's just, you know, how Ukraine, the United States was creating a coup, right? It's very easy to slip assumptions in if you're not careful, and I'm not going to allow her to just slip that in.
the incoming Ukrainian army with shovels and gardening tools. So does this show us that they're better equipped now?
Yeah, this has been a training program that's actually been in evolution from what I understand. So it was, as I say, a kind of mix of civilian and military initiative. And what I mean by that is, whilst it was volunteer instructors, many of them were former special forces, Spetsnaz officers that were lending their experience. And
That's why I say it was involuntary, or it was voluntary, not homegrown. Okay, earlier he used the term homegrown as if the people there were just like, you know what, let's start training ourselves. No, these were Russian soldiers coming in to help them get up to speed so that they could be a useful force when called upon.
Recently, that's therefore evolved to even units that have been fighting near Robotina have been rotated out and then have gone to Crimea to then share their experience. And we're talking about very recent developments such as drone warfare, which has really come to fruition at this point in time, whereas it wasn't so prominent before. The initiative in Crimea actually services civilians now in the Donetsk region, Lugansk region, Kherson and Zaporozhye. So from that peninsula, they go out to help with those civilians. Equally, as we know, it hasn't happened since September back last year with mobilization, but this has been extremely useful for those mobilized soldiers who then got called up. So the wisdom behind this program has already borne fruit, perhaps even saved lives in certain circumstances. So that's something that they are fine-tuning on an ever going process. As veterans, as I say, get rotated out, they then come back to then prepare civilians who we don't know, maybe in the future will be mobilized, or
yeah, they probably will. They're going to be okay. So we weirdly agree that this is happening. Maybe not the reason why, but that the people in these occupied areas are being trained at least minimally so that they can fight against Ukrainians when they get there. Now, how much resistance Ukraine is going to encounter when they actually get through is an open question. I think it'll be fairly minimal. There'll be the hardcore that are being trained, but most of the population, I don't think, is going to be nearly as much of a threat to the Ukrainian government as they seem to perceive.
go on to volunteer, as has happened in the hundreds of thousands.
Right, but it's not a forced conscription.
Not
right?
at this
so
juncture,
you could
no.
see how the
Okay,
West.
in some places there is, like in the Donbas, there are some places. In Crimea, I don't know, and I can't verify that it would be or would not be.
West could spin this and say, oh, they're taking these guys and making them be military fighters when they don't want to be.
One thing
the West could spin this, but in the Donbas, that's actually happened. So that's not spin. That has actually taken place.
Notes, and this was something of a Soviet culture that I was told about back in Soviet school systems. Towards the later stages of education, children were taught emergency crisis response, as well as weapon handling. That has recently, by President Putin's decree, been reintroduced to the Russian education system across the entire country.
Okay, and that's true. 10th grade, 11th grade, they're being taught basic military skills in order to prepare them, because Putin has no sense of shutting this down or going away. They're preparing like pre-basic training in high school now, and that is happening in Russia. There's no question about that.
So there is a form of civilian preparation that's also taking place, not just in civilians, but also teenagers in the later stages of their education. So if we look at this as therefore then a bit further than that, if you like, where they then put in the practical skills of actual live firing, which of course I don't believe the children currently do, but they take these skills much further, you know.
Wow. Okay, I have to think about that for a second, because to my mind, there's nothing wrong with learning what the military knows about first aid and survival and all of those things. But I cannot imagine this going down in a Western country because, one, we're so afraid of hurting children's feelings and scaring them. And two, we would see it as sort of a pro-war type thing. So I'm going to have to think about that.
I would
how
maybe suggest that you look at it from...
So look at her biases. Like her bias is that this can't go on. My kids are in Civil Air Patrol as it is now, and they do land navigation, and they do learn basic military skills that are useful. No, they are not firing or learning how to get in formations to kill others, but they're learning a lot of discipline and executing basic tasks that are helping them grow and become better. And he's going to talk about that kind of thing. But her sense is very anti-West, and I picked this up with a lot of these guys. A couple of days ago, I did this one video where I was just asking the question, like, this guy says that the chief proponents of Russian talking points are, there's some flaw in them that is causing them to be used by the Russian government. And I think there is something there. Now, his concept was that there is some kind of like sexual deviancy or something. I don't know that that's the case, but there generally is some kind of real chip on the shoulder or anti-West kind of position that these commentators have, that they naturally align themselves with, whether they're sought out or they just naturally fit that way.
More of a, I'm not going to say Russian, but Asian philosophy and mindset of discipline. I know that I left the school straight away and went into the army. And I know as an 18, 19-year-old, I did benefit, as painful as it was, being a cocky young man, to be put in my place. But that discipline and control and understanding the hierarchy and when to do just what you're told to do because other people depend upon it, I believe has been a very valuable lesson. And I believe these are still things, such even as respect as well. Respect for authority and your superiors and even elders as well is something that's still true. And as you say, in mainstream Western culture, those qualities, those beliefs were dying away.
Yes.
Yeah, and so that was my experience as well. I was in Army JROTC in high school, and again, we had a lot of that discipline kind of stuff. And I was in ROTC in college for the first 2 years before Bill Clinton killed my ROTC program for the peace dividend and said, "Thank you for coming." So that was a useful experience for me, and my children are in Civil Air Patrol as a consequence, because I recognize that this is a useful thing for them to grow into. But that's different than what they're doing in Russia.
Yeah. Well, you've given me so much to think about when it comes to that. So, yeah, it's a completely cultural divide, and we've done stories here on Redacted about how the U.S. military is now fully supporting gender transition because we're so worried about people having their feelings hurt. And so that feels like the biggest gap between cultures that I can even think about. Now, if, as the West wants, Russia were to, this is something I've been thinking about a lot, because we know that the Ukrainian army has suffered massive, massive losses. but yet they still are attacking in Crimea and the Black Sea and inside Russian areas of Donbas. So how long?
What? I'm recording something. Please go out.
Long do you think they can do that while losing so many? And does that sort of reduce the need for preparation on behalf of the people living there?
We could probably split it into sort of two aspects. I believe what you're describing is more the push down in the Zaporozhye region, where we have these sort of light infantry, small groups that are still throwing themselves into the security zone, the minefields, and so on. There's a very high human cost there, which is very tragic. Now, very recently, there has been an intensification of attacks directly on the Crimean Peninsula. Some of them have been small squads in boats that have been sent on suicide missions.
Well, of course, it's not just that. There's a lot. The way that they frame it is to minimize this, to say, see, essentially, it's failed. Nothing really is happening here. But it is picking up momentum. It's both picking up momentum around the line, where there is a little bit more and more of a breakthrough regularly. Again, it's not huge, but there's been a huge intensification of strikes in Crimea, particularly.
The frequency of those have been far smaller. What we've seen make the news very recently are these missile strikes. The UK even owning up to the use of Storm Shadow, allegedly, used to potentially damage a submarine that was in dry dock.
Not damage a submarine, punch 3 holes in a submarine to make it a $300 million submarine that is no longer serviceable ever.
So these are reminders, certainly for the people of the Crimean Peninsula, that this is not just something that's happening in the Donbas region. It still very much affects them. And of course, these landings on their beaches and land mean that in the case of the Crimean people, not that they necessarily have to be military prepared, but certainly emergency prepared if you talk about these strikes and explosions. Not to say that they have been a high frequency of civilian targets struck, such as we've seen in Donetsk, but nonetheless, this response sort of procedure and program is obviously still very much relevant and required to ensure that, again, lives are saved in those crisis moments.
Yeah. Well, this is fascinating. And I wish that, there was something we all could learn from each other. Like I said, I wouldn't mind learning the types of skills that people who go through any military have to learn, or passing that on to my children. But I wish that it wasn't a world where it was necessary. So
you can, but if you were in the United States, you're in, I think, Portugal, because you're trying to not be in the United States for some reason that I don't really understand. Something about a shady real estate deal is what people have told me, but I'm not exactly sure. So I'm not going to say exactly what it is. But if you were in the United States, your local Civil Air Patrol or a JROTC in high school or something would teach all those kind of things. But that's a world away from where we are with what former Spetsnaz were teaching in a voluntary capacity informally to these people in Crimea, or even worse, what's being taught to mandatorily to 10th and 11th graders in high school, because Putin is preparing them to go. He's preparing their mentality to soften them to be more amenable to joining the army in a long war. Okay. This was a weird one because we're agreeing with what is taking place, even if we're disagreeing about why it is, or the perspective from which they come, or the assumptions that they bring to the table. So tell me what you thought about this. It's happening, but I don't know that Crimea is going to be all that resistant. Before the war, the eastern regions, the oblasts that have been gobbled up by Russia, including Crimea, were reasonably pro-Russia compared to the rest of the country, but now it's down to the single digits, and I just don't see that resistance, but I could be wrong. Tell me what you think. Thank you for your time, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.